Hi, this is Jeff Carpenter. I lead the incident response consulting practice at Secureworks. And today I'm here with Christina Richmond of IDC. And we're here to talk about her recent blog entry, giving some insight into COVID 19 and working through from crisis to recover the new normal. Welcome, Christina.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here.
In your blog entry, you talked about five phases of COVID 19 that are aligned to security services, and IDC also announced their official steps from crisis to innovation. Can you talk to us about, at a high level, what those steps are and how there may be indicators, what indicators there may be to demonstrate that a company is in which phase?
Oh, you bet, Jeff. Thanks for asking. It's interesting. Not all companies are going to be in the same place at the same time. Maybe geographically there are certain areas of the world that are in the same place at the same time. But to outline those steps, we look at both business focus and economic focus. We're looking at business continuity as the first piece. And that aligns with the crisis. So in my blog, I talked about how companies had to reframe. They had to figure out, oh my gosh, how are we going to respond to this crisis? Where are we going to put our workers? How are we going to get enough laptops? How are we going to deploy all of the new technologies and make sure that they're secure? So we went from crisis, as you rightly said, all the way out to innovation or to what we're calling the next normal, or where we see the future enterprise emerging from this. And so there were five steps. There's business continuity, cost optimization, business resiliency, targeted investments, and then the future enterprise. And that's the business layer. The economic layer goes from the crisis to an economic slowdown, which is where I think we are today, into a recession. I would even argue that we're here in North America in the recession. And then we come to a return to growth and what we're calling the next normal. So in my blog, I framed it slightly differently. As you know, I talked about reframing in the beginning, which is that crisis and business continuity piece. And then I talked about refresh, which is that cost optimization and the economic slowdown that I talked about in the more high level IDC perspective. Then I talked about recover, which aligns to business resiliency and the recession. So that was sort of like, wow, we're really at the bottom of the curve and we have to come out of this looking at how do we align our assets so that we um, manage to come out in a way that is healthier than where we are today. So it might look like reducing staff, it might look like rationalization of our IT assets, it might look like divesting from some of our real estate. And then the rebound in my blog was about what kind of investments are companies going to make and how are they going to return to growth? And then finally, the recreate layer was what does how do we come out of this and innovate and become, our future selves, if you will? So I would say right now, Jeff, we're probably globally somewhere between the economic slowdown and the recession. There are certain areas of the globe that are returning to growth and companies are beginning to make some targeted investments. I don't think there are many places on the planet and many companies that are in that emerging from the ashes place, which is what we call the next normal or the future enterprise, or what I called recreate in my blog.
So I was interested when I was reading your blog at the beginning phases, the crisis management phase. You mentioned that many companies are turning to MSSPs for assistance. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? What kind of assistance they're looking for and how that fits into their response?
So we've done about 20 weeks of surveying on COVID-19 specifically. And what we're seeing is that folks did jump into managed security services to help them once they were losing staff or repurposing their staff's mission to be able to deploy new laptops, set up home networks, make sure that they had secure VPN. Once that was in place, what they discovered was a lot of those resources were looking at how do we move to the cloud more rapidly? How do we digitize our business or digitally transform, which gives greater agility, greater cost efficiencies? And so a lot of companies were accelerating digital transformation, and a lot of those IT resources were repurposed, if you will, to look at other things besides security. Or some companies just purely lost staff. They either had to do layoffs or um, cut down hours, if you will. So with that, companies realized they needed help to manage the day-to-day. They needed a company such as an MSSP to help them with the day-to-day hygiene, the maybe configuration of new systems or doing patch management for existing systems, but also to be the eyes on screen to make sure that as attacks were occurring, that someone was paying attention to the alerts and the logs from those systems.
So you predicted that digital transformation is going to continue through all of the phases. When you consider the movement with digital transformation, how are companies thinking about incident response readiness under that scenario, and how has thinking changed from pre-COVID? And by readiness, I mean plans, tools, partners, people. There's lots of components to incident response readiness.
This is one of my favorite things to talk about, Jeff, and I think you know that about
Me
me.
too.
Right? I mean, I'm a big advocate for planning. You can't respond to a crisis if you don't have a plan in place. So here's what I'm seeing. Currently, I'm seeing an escalation of attacks. Unfortunately, the attacker has not slowed down their ability to launch ransomware or phishing attacks or DDoS types of attacks. So we've seen not only an acceleration of attacks, but we've seen the adversary hitting us where we're really vulnerable in healthcare, for example, which I find terrible that attackers are going after the healthcare industry. So with that, we're seeing increased incident response services. We're hearing anecdotally from many service providers. In fact, I think almost every single one we've spoken to since the beginning of the pandemic has said, yes, we are swamped. Sadly, we are swamped with incident response. But I'm also seeing that these incident response service companies, yourselves included, are adding in readiness exercises to the retainers or at the back end of retainers. And these readiness exercises, as you so rightly say, have to do with people and process. It could be developing your playbook, practicing your playbook, making sure you know who your team is if you're breached. But it also could be those day-to-day services like pen testing or breach attack simulation that companies are starting to do more because they want to make sure that they're in a secure posture. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, it does. When we look at this issue, you could have a company that they wrote an incident response plan last year and they tested it in February, and all of a sudden it may no longer be viable based on the significant changes that have happened in their organization. I like to express this. It's like having a hurricane go through and then immediately having an earthquake. If you have an incident during this crisis, you may find that there are components to your response plan that are no longer viable because
You
underlying
are,
have been
yeah,
changed.
you're so right. You're so right, Jeff. And I mean, we just had a double hurricane come through the North American market, right? So, and there's fires and there's COVID. So we certainly have a layering of these different things that bring up the question of BCDR, your business continuity and disaster recovery plan, beyond just your incident response plan. But you are absolutely right. What we had in place last fall, and maybe the best of companies, they were looking at their plan every day and they were practicing it once a quarter or once whenever, and now everything has changed. So we have to rewrite our plans. We have to revisit them. We have to make sure that we still have those people, those resource members who should be on the team. Maybe that's changed. And your systems have now changed. Your IT infrastructure is all over the board. It's in Jane's house and Bob's house, and you're connecting through VPN to the network. You have to double check your plans on a regular basis, and you also have to probably revisit it and rewrite it.
So when you look at the phases, it sounds like in looking across those phases, it sounds like there's a lot of change that you're expecting to occur over that period of time, and maybe a lot more change than had been happening in the same period of time previously. So how does that change the dynamic of deciding when you need to test or exercise? So if I did an exercise once a year last year, maybe that isn't sufficient this year.
Yeah, that's another great question, Jeff. And so let me answer it two ways. One is, I think some of these 5 steps in our COVID curve are repetitive. You might find yourself going through crisis management several times throughout this journey that we're on. You might find that you're going through cost optimization several times during this journey that we're on with COVID as well. And we don't know when we'll come out of this pandemic. No one knows. So I have 2 answers about what the timing is for incident readiness. The first answer is it should be iterative and continuous. Things like continuous attack surface testing, or CAST, or breach attack simulation, or BAS. Both of those are software-based tools, and you can perform those tests on an iterative, continuous basis. But also doing the periodic pen testing, where you are actually hiring time and material project-based services to help you with a bigger test, should be done as well. And or some kind of simulation exercise. So I think these things have 2 different timings. One is continuous, and then one is point in time. In the recovery that I'm talking about with our 5 phases, I'm seeing not only incident readiness and response coming within the crisis or the cost optimization phases at the beginning of this curve, I'm also seeing it on the back end. I'm seeing risk management sort of in the middle, maybe the recession and business resiliency phase out to the return to growth where folks are starting to make targeted investments. And then I'm seeing you need to practice your cyber resilience, your business risk resilience. You need to practice that as you become a new innovative and future enterprise. So I'm seeing, it's probably redundant to say that this needs to iterate and happen frequently throughout. But I think with readiness, it is something you have to practice on a regular basis.
So in addition to what we've already talked about, Christina, with exercises, with pen testing, are there any other partnership areas where you're seeing organizations are reaching out to other talent to help them through the management of these five phases?
I think folks are utilizing service providers in a lot of different ways right now, Jeff. We're seeing partnerships emerge in terms of MDR, or managed detection and response, which can be a phenomenal resource for more quickly finding the adversary, detecting and response needs to increase, especially when the attacks are increasing. So we're seeing the increase of MDR, we're seeing the increase of MSS, but we're also seeing project-based services on the rise. So specific to digital transformation and cloud migration, we're seeing folks taking some of their project-based services that they may have already bought and paid for. They're changing the focus of that engagement that they have set up, and they're changing it to help them accelerate in some other fashion. So moving to multi-cloud, or moving to, if they were already on a journey to create some private cloud as well as public cloud migration, they might do that as well. What we've also found is that security can sometimes follow on the heels of these services. So in our COVID research, we're seeing peaks and valleys of security investment. And the peaks and valleys don't always align perfectly to the project-based services peaks and valleys, or to the managed security services peaks and valleys. So what we are seeing is that there is sometimes a lag between setting up your home network and then considering the security around it, or migrating to the cloud and then considering security as an after fact. But I think also you wanted to talk about tools here. And I'm not the foremost expert on tools. I think you probably have a lot more to say about specific tools that folks are using for readiness or for incident response specifically. And I'd love it if you'd jump in and talk about that.
Sure, Christina. I think, especially now in the crisis when so many things have changed, the most important thing from an incident response prep perspective and tooling is making sure you have sufficient visibility of their network. Biggest problem we have in emergency incident response is working with a customer who doesn't have sufficient visibility of their network to determine. So when you go through this radical change that we've been seeing over the past couple of months, making sure, going back and making sure, do I have the right level of logging of all these new things that I've turned on or I've changed to? Are all of the endpoints that we're using, do we have endpoint agents on those that are able to give you visibility to those machines? So I think from a tooling perspective, the most important place to look first is, do I have sufficient visibility across my now extended IT infrastructure? Extending to people's homes, extending into the cloud, making sure you have that visibility. Then the second area that I'd look at for an incident response team is tools that I may be using in the analysis of an incident. Do I have the same capability today when everyone's remote as I had when we were all working in the war room on the third floor of building 2? So going back and making sure, and this again goes back to your playbooks to see what am I going to do when I have an incident, making sure the tooling that I'm going to be making use of, that my people doing the analysis have sufficient ability to continue to use those tools. And by tooling, I mean that broadly. It can be everything from how we communicate, the tools we use to communicate, to how we do analysis, to how we share analysis results. So there's a lot of areas there to look at, focusing first on visibility and second on the tools that we use to actually respond.
And wouldn't you also say, Jeff, that in terms of visibility, you have to be able to correlate to known threats and unknown threats, and to be able to use threat hunting as well, especially right now?
Well, threat hunting is very important. Of course, the first step in threat hunting is you have to have data to hunt. So which is why I talked about visibility and making sure you have the ability to collect that data. But now, especially when we've all gone through a major transformation, hunting it's a little more difficult because you're orienting yourself to a new environment. When you're hunting, you're making a hypothesis and then testing that hypothesis, and you may have been comfortable in the environment that you had before, but now that has changed. So you have to gain comfort with your environment and making sure that you're able to sufficiently ask the right questions and look for the answers to those questions in a potentially dramatically changed environment.
That's interesting, really interesting. And I would just add that we've written about MDR and how it's kind of the next generation of MSS in some ways. And what's required with MDR services would be not just automated sort of threat hunting that might be included in a tool, but and also not just reactive threat hunting in an incident or a breach, but proactive, which I think is what you were just referring to, making a hypothesis and going and looking at the data that you now have visibility to, or you've continued having visibility to, and then testing that hypothesis across your environment. Is that correct?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
So we wandered a little bit here, but I think we've got some really interesting insights on threat hunting.
Thank you for coming today and talking about the five phases and what that means for organizations and especially incident response. Do you have any final thoughts for us?
You bet. So thank you so much for having me today. This was really fun, Jeff. I always enjoy chatting with you, and we kind of go off on tangents, but it's always so interesting to me. I learn a lot chatting with you, and so thank you. I think what's important is that we're somewhat out of the damage control phase. We're out of the crisis for the most part. We're, globally looking at cost optimization and business resiliency. Um, Probably companies are not quite into the targeted investment in terms of innovation quite yet. Maybe the lucky ones are. Maybe they were already in a completely cloud-based environment or software-defined architecture. Maybe they were completely building their security into a zero trust environment, and they can innovate and grow out of this crisis, especially if they're not in one of the hardest hit industries. But it's going to depend on where we are geographically, economically, in terms of our architecture, our IT architecture, as well as our security architecture, where we find ourselves on this curve. So I would say capacity optimization has been really important and will continue to be. I would say consistent resiliency practice is really critical. And then continual enhancement as we pull up out of this crisis will be very important as well.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Christina. It's always a joy to talk with you.
It was my pleasure, Jeff. Thanks so much.